A warm welcome from my side. I'm sitting in Erfurt and I'm pleased to open another lecture today to introduce my colleague Martin Scheutz from the University of Vienna. Martin Scheutz studied history and German language and literature in Vienna. He trained at the Institute of Austrian Historical Research and has been professor of modern history since 2001. His initial research was even more concentrated on the history of crime in the early modern period. It was in this context that I first met Martin in the late 1990s. But since then, he has also been working on urban history, on the history of the Viennese court, the history of hospitals and poverty, on religion in the city, and on the genre of ego documents, as we say. Martin Scheutz is also Secretary General of the Commission Internationale pour l'Histoire des Villes since 2010. Among his many publications, I would like to highlight one in particular. It is in German ein bürgerliches Pulverfass, which can be translated as a civic powder keg, gun ownership and gun control in the ancien European city. A volume he has co-edited together with Werner Freitag. I will put the link to the website in the chat so that you can follow this. So the floor is yours, Martin.
Yes.
And I would like to announce that at the end of the session, at around 6:55, my colleague Katalin Sende would like to make an announcement before we leave the room. So Martin, please start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I try to share I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for joining this lecture, and it's a pleasure to see you at least on the screen, although we don't have face-to-face communication. Yes, the idea behind this lecture given today is, as Susanne put it, on the one hand, it was a section on the German Historikertag, the biannual meeting of German historians in Münster some years ago, and with a section, Werner Freitag and me, on those civic gunpowder, as we told it. And on the other hand, you always read a lot of, you see a lot of news from America, and I just put one of those pictures. You see Barack Obama accompanied by another president who is now president, who was vice president at that time, Joe Biden. And it was a shooting in Orlando 2016, and you have a lot of those news we get on our screens, we read in papers, and this is what made me think about the situation of the weapons are back in town. And I was wondering, what's the background? And that's where my reflections will start. What will be the outline of the lecture, of the paper given today? I try to have 3 points and an introduction, citizens' registers, in German Bürgerbücher, weapons and their centralizations. This is the story of armories in the cities, and the armory is a kind of pre-modern museum, and final remarks at the end. Well, I start with my paper. European citizenship in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period was based primarily on the citizens' participation in urban governance. Within the city, a specific court was competent for matters concerning the citizens, and ultimately only those who exercised certain civic economic activities could become citizens. The defense of the city and maintaining peace within its walls were part of civic duties, and these included guard duties at the gates, night watches, and fire prevention. To fulfill these obligations, possessing weapons was mandatory for every citizen, and the possession or bearing of arms depended on several factors such as political rights, gender, social status, and age. Every citizen, including the head of a citizen's household, had to participate in the city's defense by being a member of a military association according to the martial ethic of the late medieval and early modern city. In terms of citizenship rights, weapons were considered a citizen's privilege and a distinguishing mark. Weapon-carrying citizens were visually distinguishable from journeymen or servants. Thus, the citizens of Austrian cities took part in the annual Corpus Christi procession, considered as a sign of Catholic reform, bearing arms. They also appeared armed as a guard of honor at the act of hereditary homage of a new sovereign, or solemnly awaited the ruler of the city at its gates. Until the 17th century, aspirants were generally required to provide defensive weapons and pieces of armor fit for use before being granted citizenship. In addition to taking the oath of citizenship, in some cities, new citizens even fired a kind of ritual citizen shot to denote having been accepted as citizens, both symbolically and acoustically. Citizens had to present arms at regular intervals and have them examined for fitness. They also had to register with the shooting societies and take part in regular shooting exercises at the shooting range, usually located outside the city or in the city moat. Given the fact of the right to resist, every head of a household was allowed to defend his house with an armed hand and to put intruders in their place by force of arms. This necessity to have armed citizens is clearly illustrated by the example of Salzburg, the city of Salzburg. In 1287, after conflicts took place within the city, Archbishop Rudolf ordered all citizens to be allowed to keep armor and weapons to protect the city and, if necessary, to rush to aid to the house of God. Citizens with armor had to pay a fine to the city and immediately present armor. It was not until the 17th century that this passage was amended to the effect that Salzburg's citizens now had to possess uniforms and weapons. As part of the proceedings after a citizen's death and the ensuing compilation of inventories, armament can also be seen as a condition of citizenship in them. However, possession of weapons was by no means limited to males. In the early 15th century, for example, a Viennese carpenter bequeathed his descendants not only a wood plate and a saw, but also a breastplate and greaves to his sister-in-law. However, the heiress would most probably not wear the armor, but sell or lend it. Weapons had a great value on the second-hand market. Owning weapons was problematic because the citizens had to keep pace with the contemporary technology. The bourgeois crossbow of the late Middle Ages was increasingly replaced in the 16th century inventories of Austrian towns by the technically refined matchlock guns and later wheel-lock guns. These possession of weapons by citizens created problems once and again due to their improper handling or negligent storage. Weapons, especially knives, were quickly at hand, especially in case of conflicts. The rapier, still in its scabbard, was often used as a striking weapon, whereas the drawn rapier rarely caused injuries. Cutting and stabbing weapons, as well as firearms, were ubiquitous in citizens' parlors and chambers. Accidents were repeatedly the result of poor weapon storage. In 1611, for example, a citizen of a small Austrian town handled his handgun so clumsily that a shot went off and killed the former bailiff. Another citizen fired some shots in his house and was arrested for improper handling of the weapon. However, this did not cast any doubt on the fundamental right of citizens to bear arms. The defense of the city in times of crisis was a civic duty, not only in the Middle Ages, but also in modern times. Until the 18th century, city councils ordered the citizens to have powder, lead, and a clean rifle at the ready in view of the War of Spanish Succession. In times of crisis, the authorities of a city threatened by enemies summoned the entire citizenry to the city hall, reminded them of the oath of citizenship, and exhorted them to get sufficient weapons and ammunition for themselves. Times of crisis show particularly well how early modern cities organized their defense. Immediate danger of war, for example, during the 30 Years' War, quickly turned citizens into soldiers who had to join military formations. With the modern era and the strengthening of the regular army, the importance of the citizens' ability to defend themselves diminished, given the fact of military professionalization. Nevertheless, in larger cities, citizens had to join the uniformed citizens or rifle corps mainly to perform guard duties. In Graz, for example, new citizens were assigned either to the Citizens' Rifle Corps, Cavalry Corps, or Grenadier Corps. The training of Feuerwerker, it is civic artillerymen, was part of the civil defense organized by the city's armory and, as can be seen in the example of Vienna after 1683, was intensified, especially in times of crisis. The armed citizens were grouped together in foot or horseback companies and integrated into the Landesaufgebot, the national levy. Still during the Napoleonic War, the citizens of sovereign cities were also conscribed into the Landwehr, the territorial army composed of non-professional soldiers. In order to show you a bit of those civic firemen, you would see a kind of Ernstfeuerwerk. It is called in German. This means a serious firework. This means here the citizens had to prove in the public how they would manage to make use of cannons. And this was quite done in a great ceremony. And you see a lot of engravings where you see the burghers, the citizens who are rather proud of their ability to shoot and to fire. I've taken another one. This one, the left one, is 1684. This means immediately after this second siege of Vienna in 1683, it was of advantage for the Viennese citizens to show that they were able to defend the city again against the Ottomans, for example. And I think the third one, yes. And you see here, this is very often done in order to meet a kind of target. In this case, it was a pirate ship. This was the great time of the Algerian pirates in the 1720s and 30s, and they tried to imitate this fact. I come to my first point: citizens' registers as a source for ownership of weapons. In addition to inventory research, the history of citizens' weapons ownership can often be illustrated on the basis of armory stocks and their regular inventories. Attempts to prove the importance of owning weapons or the ability to bear weapons as a citizens are made on the award of civil rights, so-called Bürgerbücher, it is citizens' registers, were created in many cities to ensure that city inhabitants had a legal means of proving their status, but but also for communal accounting purposes or administrative agendas. They were also used to record the newly admitted citizens and sometimes to separate the legally inferior fellow inhabitants from the actual citizens. These Bürgerbücher are also known under several related names, most of them from the modern time, but sometimes also contemporary collective terms for medieval and modern city registers, such as Oath Book, for example. They contain the names of the admitted citizens and sometimes also other inhabitants, taking into account other forms of civil rights, such as citizens of honor. They should document the taking of oath of citizenship by these new citizens before representatives of the city council. These books served to admit persons as citizens and were intended to record the process of admission to citizenship of a new citizens over long periods of time in writing and in a legally binding form for the city council or a city administration. In the early modern period, the inhabitants of many cities were essentially divided into two groups. On the one hand, the Bürger, the citizens, inhabitants owning land or a house within the limits of the city's jurisdiction. On the other hand, the Inwohner or Mitbürger, inhabitants without such property. For both groups of inhabitants, there was usually the obligation to take the oath of citizenship. In addition to the formalities of applying for citizenship, which differed according to whether one had citizens' ancestors or not, the conditions under which one could become a member of the community of jurors also changed over time. According to the Austrian citizens' registers, the requirements for being awarded citizenship varied depending on the legal status of the town. The applicant for citizenship had to have a fixed profession, own a house in the respective city, prove the ownership of sufficient assets, be married, and commit to profess a certain religion. In addition, he was required to have been born in wedlock and, last but not least, had to be deemed worthy for being able to make a significant contribution to the community. A few of the Austrian citizens' registers also record the possession of weapons on being awarded citizenship, which was a male privilege. Women could only become citizens, if at all, as widow or wives. Despite some similarities in the entries, such as date, fees, names, the Austrian citizens' registers used subsequently also show major differences in their layout. In some citizens' registers, information on the place of origin, occupation, or even possession of weapons is missing. The sensitivity of citizens' records to weapon-related matters becomes clear, for example, when among the Viennese citizens, an above-average number of blacksmiths died after the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. In the following year, 1684, not only were 176 new citizens admitted, significantly more than the average, but metal-working professions such as locksmiths and blacksmiths were now also pushed significantly because it was important for cities to manufacture and repair their own weapons. Weapons are, for example, and this is the slide I show you, are mentioned in the Innsbruck Citizens Register between the year 1600 and 1708. This has been done by Michael Brokosch, who is writing a thesis on this topic. If we take a look at the records of the 405 citizens admitted, I have also a lot of numbers. If we take a look at the records of the 405 citizens admitted without the Inwohner, within this period, we can see that about 3/5 of all applicants were already equipped with weapons. Only 4 of the men had no weapons, but just accoutrements. After 145 persons, neither the possession of weapons nor a summons to appear at the muster or any other mention of military matters are listed. Nor does there seem to have been any correlation between the recorded possession of weapons and the place of origin or the profession of those admitted. Those armed display various types of fighting equipment to the council, the most frequently mentioned being firearms in 193 cases. Muskets are mentioned in 171 entries, almost over the entire period. Citizens' possession of weapons seem to have been decisively shaped by gender, discourse of honor, and social status, and, while ostensibly serving primarily to defend oneself, also emphasized male and social role models, separating strangers from residents, but also differentiating men from women. The fact that weapons technology developed rapidly from the end of the 30 Years' War onwards, and that the citizens' ability to defend themselves gradually lost importance due to the creation of the state armies, also appears to be important for the modern citizens' acceptance and ability to bear arms. The armed citizenry was thus increasingly relegated to a poorly representative role in Corpus Christi processions and hereditary tributes within the framework of citizen corps and citizen companies. After the rebels of the Ottomans in the second half of the 17th century, armed citizens played an increasingly marginal role in the Austrian hereditary lands. In the civic self-image of the early modern period, the link between civic rights and the possession of weapons remained. Early modern citizens anchored their self-image in a profoundly urban civic culture of weapons. My second point would be weapons in town and their centralization. I have a quotation from Johann Heinrich Zedler, Universallexikon, which I put here. Arsenal or the armory is a suitable place which is dedicated both to the manufacture and the preservation of all things necessary for attacking, but also for defending a place. The armory must be erected near the city fortification so that in any emergency weapons can be quickly brought to the ramparts. In this sense, armories stored various types of weapons, while arsenals were understood more as a kind of supply base, a production site for the guns, and as shipyards. However, in contemporary linguistic practice, the use of these terms is nevertheless mixed. In terms of building types, armories are part of a kind of storage building that were initially civilian. Just look here. In terms of development history, wooden warehouses, granaries, salt stores, or the building yards of medieval towns, but also castles and fortifications, which served as multifunctional stores for building equipment and materials, were the origin of the armory type that emerged in the 15th century. The easy delivery and removal of goods via inclined levels and sliding boards, air convection through a large number of closable and lockable windows, security from the outside, but also protection against pests such as mice, rats, and birds, as well as fire safety, were constitutive factors for these storage buildings. With the development of firearms and the early modern formation of standing armies, these civilian storage buildings were soon followed by military storage buildings such as hay, floor magazines, assembly chambers, powder magazines, stable, straw magazines, and also armories. The armory stands at the point of the intersection between civil and military architecture and architectural history, so that among the early modern armory architects, there were both military construction engineers and civil architects. This dichotomy is also reflected in the exterior design of the buildings. I'll just show you one of the early buildings here from Vorarlberg, from Feldkirch. For a long time, a fundamentally sober character of the armories prevailed, with a representational character created primarily by the massiveness of the multi-axial exterior facades, which were prominently located in the urban space. In his Architectura Civili Militaris of 1719, the architectural theorist Leonhard Christian Sturm considers armory architecture to be situated in the area of tension between strength and daintiness. Quotation here, the beauty of armories consists more in a good proportion than in great architectural ornamentation, as he put it. The centralization of cities' possession of weapons can be illustrated by the example of the royal capital Vienna. Until 1562, when a city armory was built, bowl weapons, crossbows, bows, and small arms were kept in the gate towers, while the suits of armor were kept in the down hall in the Wiblinger Straße. The advent of firearms in the late Middle Ages led to an increase in the city's artillery, which from 1463 until 1542 was stored in the old armory at the western end of the High Market. By adapting an old grain store, a new armory was built in 1532 at the Vienna's meat market behind St. Lawrence Monastery, which, however, only served this purpose for about 30 years. In 1562, a new armory was built at the Am Hof Square. We'll show you slides later on. The new type of armory became necessary in places and locations where, due to military threats, pieces of equipment and weapons had to be stored centrally and made available quickly, whereby the safe storage of powder and the regular care and maintenance of the collection of weapons, which had to be looked after more intensively since the introduction of firearms, were also important. In contrast to halberds, lances, and small arms, the cost-intensive artillery, in particular, for which a new type of building the armory was needed, could only be financed by larger cities or by the local ruler. Various different institutions for armories can be identified. In addition to the aristocratic armories in castles or fortresses, just think of the Esterhazy family, it was above all the local ruler who established armories in various places, preferably residences or strategically important locations. Furthermore, the territorial estates had their own armories, which served to equip the estate's troops. Another type of armory is the city armory, whereby the term citizens' armory should generally be questioned, because ultimately, as can sometimes be seen from the inscriptions on armory, the city ruler was the actual owner of the armory. A comparison between Austrian armories and other European armories showed both uniformity and differences with today's Austria. The modern era is characterized by institutionalization and an increasing domestication, Verhäuslichung in German, of functions. The establishment of standing armies meant that the type of armory formed in the second half of the 15th century became part of the territorial ruler's agenda in many places, and the artillery corps, which were expensive to maintain, was subordinate to the territorial ruler's army. Against this background, the construction of armories can be interpreted as an expression of the consolidation of power by the rulers and as a shift of statehood towards the territorial ruler. Only large cities with their own military sovereignty and with newer fortifications maintained a city contingent that was able to meet the military requirements. The construction of new armories flourished in the Holy Roman Empire, but also in other parts of early modern Europe between 1530 and 1650, when around half of the known armories were built. Against the background of the growing mercenary armies and the 30 Years' War, a century of creation of armories became apparent. Several cities further developed the medieval storehouses by adapting them. New armories were built mainly in imperial cities, but also in the residences of territorial rulers, as some example prove. Many cities even had armories belonging to the cities and the territorial ruler in parallel. For example, Ulm, Dresden, Kassel, Gießen, Nuremberg, Lübeck, Cologne. While the early armories were mostly unadorned but impressive in their structural dimensions and sometimes had ornate portals, the appearance of armories changed markedly as of the late 17th century, when the newly created armories came closer to palace buildings, as shown by the Royal Prussian Armory in Berlin. I just brought some examples with me where you can see the unadorned armories just here in Danzig, another engraving. And you see here the difference, which makes the armories more and more to kind of a question of palace architecture. The imposing Berlin armory was built in the context of the royal dignity bestowed on Brandenburg in 1701 and was erected by a total of 4 architects during the reign of 3 rulers. You see, there's much money in this armory. Vienna Citizens Armory, the Bürgerliches Zeughaus, only underwent a clear representative valorization in the era of the facade in the 1730s through the redesign by Anton Johann Ospel, undertaken in the spirit of the representative culture of Emperor Charles VI through the sculptures by Lorenzo Mattielli. Just show it here. Vienna has parallel different types of armories. On the right hand, you see the imperial armory, which is large. It's the largest courtyard in the inner city of Vienna, besides the Hofburg. And on the other hand, you see here on the left side, you see the civic armory, Bürgerliches Zeughaus. And this is a rather, this is a scene from the place Am Hof. And at the end, in the corner, you will see those armory before the redesignment by Anton Johann Ospel. And you see how it looks like now in the moment. While the old plain citizens' armory was grouped around 2 narrow courtyards, and the round-arched main portal was even displaced from central axis, the armorer and former Liechtenstein court architect Ospel was able to realize his design around the central inner courtyard after a long planning process. Fitted into a square, the building is crowned by a full white triangle gable resting on 2 pairs of pilaster, in which martial emblems are found in dense rows. Above the gable is a massive attic crowned by 2 stone statues embodying Charles VI's motto of bravery and perseverance, holding a copper globe with the monogram of Charles VI. The inscription, dated in 1732, emphasizes the imperial reign over the city. It's a long inscription. You don't have to read it all. No, it's the main core. The feature is Imperante Carolo VI instauravit senatus populusque Vienna. It means it's the emperor speaking here, and the burghers are in just following his will. My last point will be, here you will see the different arsenals, the different armories here in the city. On the one hand, the civic one, on the other hand, the imperial one, and not so known, maybe up to now, Vienna even had an armory of ships. My third point would be the armories as a kind of early modern museum. Armories which were regarded as a sign of early modern state formation, also took over the functions of museum soon after they were founded. In addition to the storage of weapons, the exhibition of memorabilia also seems to have been of great importance. The service instruction of the Vienna city armorer of 1783 stipulates that, quote, only persons of respectable standing were allowed to see the instruments in the armory, end of quote. No one was allowed to be told the number of mortars, shotguns, and the like kept. While the 17th century, presumable also in Austria, it was mainly noble guests on the Cavalier tour who visited the armories under the guidance of the armorer, the clientele of armory visitors changed in the 18th century to citizens, scholars, and traveling officials. In the large imperial city of Nuremberg, you see the slide here, the armories also served as a kind of showroom for local arms production. In 1630, the Nuremberg armorer Johann Karl created a scale collection of around 170 models of tanks, limbers, gun carriages, cannon, and other war equipment as a reference installation. This means it's a small scale model army. In many cities, a selection of ancient weapons was deliberately kept as a reminder of their own history. The Nuremberg Council had its artillery renewed in 1512, but deliberately kept the obsolete big cannon in the collection of weapons. In the armories, which were increasingly transformed into exhibition depots, not only ancient but new weapon systems awaited socially elevated people and dignitaries, but also local specifics and memorabilia widely transmitted in travel accounts. As of the 18th century, the musealization of the armory stocks as public collection progressed, also because the function and context of the objects kept had gradually changed. Many of the objects exhibited in the armories had been withdrawn from the economic cycle of object of use and now served to invent a historical tradition of drawing traditions from all material for certain present-oriented purposes. Numerous armories had special features such as an armor puppet and figurines, such in Luzern, Switzerland, Entlebuchel, or in Solothurn, you have a kind of figure which was called Zughusjöckle. In Bremen's armory, 2 riders in armor were displayed on wooden horses. As soon as you lifted the tail of one of the horses, the wooden horse made a tremulous sound, the loud sounding emblem of the Bremen's armory. Although armories were a manifestation of a new regionalization unprecedented in world history, in whose halls there was a constant ordering, standardization, layering, weighing, classifying, and counting, these functional elements of pre-modern logic were also found in this early modern knowledge order or knowledge regime. Thus, even the oldest German language weekly newspaper of the Holy Roman Empire, the Strasbourg Relation, at the very beginning, Strasbourg Relation was first published in 1609. And in the very beginning, the Strasbourg Relation cites in March 1609 an example of the haunting of the Vienna armory occurring rather frequently in the early modern period. You read there, many ghosts can be seen among the king's soldiers, which frighten them so much that they fall ill. As Mr. Ferdinand of Kollenitsch, an armor-clad man in the armory, admitted that he was walking towards him. He disappeared into a large box. When he looked into it, it was a dead man. Subsequently, he fell ill, so that no worried about his life. This is a story very often written these ghost stories, no Chinese ghost stories, but armory ghost stories, restage the armory, hitherto irrational weapons collection, reviving the weapons that had become functionless in a supernatural way and landing the armory a patriotic appeal. The sophisticated technology of the weapons on display was joined by the narrative of the incalculable and the ungovernable. In mid-18th century, the armories of the estates and the cities came under pressure due to state reforms and the increasing rationalization and mechanization of military, though that the early modern state wanted to abandon the estate's technically obsolete weapons collection altogether. In 1749, I show you the entrance of the Zeughaus, Grazer Zeughaus, very famous. In 1749, Maria Theresa proposed to the Styrian estates that they abandoned the Graz armory, ceding the usable weapons to the Court Council of War, Hofkriegsrat, and scrapping the rest, which the Styrian estates firmly rejected. By the end of the 18th century, the Graz armory stored a large collection of obsolete museum-quality guns, which in the course of the coalition wars were not to be allowed to fall into the hands of the French, and therefore in 1797, in view of the advancing French army, were taken to Novi Sad, where this obsolete cannon bark was finally sold for its metal price in 1805. Armories can be interpreted not only as cabinets of curiosity, but also as an early modern house of patriotic history that presented captured weapons and trophies, staged their own history with them, signaled military power through the deliberately displayed abundance of guns and armors, but also arranged weapons in the manner of a botanical collection, in the sense of Linné, maybe. In the 18th century must be regarded as the phase of the institutionalization of the armory as a place of remembrance. I come to my final remarks. Weapons ownership can be understood as a citizen's right, but it gradually became less important in the course of modern times. Conversely, the idea that citizens have a right to bear arms was also exported to the new colonies, where this idea is still common today and leads to major problems. As early as the late Middle Ages, and especially with the growing importance of artillery, city governments attempted to concentrate weapons. Austria's armories, which are on the whole poorly researched, were built in the time of Maximilian I and his successor, Ferdinand I, and were generally large and impressive buildings, but not particularly representative. As the architectural theorist Leonhard Christoph Sturm correctly put it, the beauty of armories lay above all in their neat structural proportions and in the clearance of the design, but less in their decorative elements. The functionality of these storehouses, the monumentality of the cannon halls, and the large courtyard in front of them made a strong impression on early modern travelers. The material value stored in armories was high, as the instruction of armorers, of rulers and cities well attest. In the 18th century, the museum function became increasingly important. More and more visiting citizens used the skillfully staged display depots of the armories to experience the history of cities, but also the principalities at first hand through the inspiring materiality of weapons and armor. There is no doubt that the Hall of Fame of the National Monument in the later Viennese arsenal was already broadly conceived at the time of early modern armories. And there's a I just showed it. There you see the kind of ordering of weapons in a sense of botanical collection, in the sense of Linné, maybe you could see here. And this is my last slide, which shows firework and the use of weapons is closely related. You see the explosion of one of the famous Viennese fireworker. His lab exploded in 1833. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Do you want to close your presentation?
Yes, I have to stop it, sorry. Yes, no.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now we have the plenary session, so to say, and as you probably already know, we give priority to the students to raise their questions. So what do you like to know or add or comment? Please give a sign in with your digital hand, or you can also, of course, write into the chat.
It's hard to break the ice.
I don't know who was first. Joshua, do you want to like to start?
Sure. Mr. Schutz, first, thank you so much for the presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. One question I would have, as these older weapons were still being maintained right up until the point where they could no longer be used, right up until they were no longer as useful to the city as they had been, was there any shuffling that would happen that we know about at all, where as the city expanded and a new area is built, they would put newer weapons closer to the wall and shuffle the older material back to a more central location? Are there any records of that happening in planned like mass events, or was it just slowly over time as it was needed?
I think it was slowly moved for all I see. If I understood it correctly, you mean if the cities expanded of whether the weapons were moved to the new areas? Was this the question?
So it's part of that, and also partly, was there a sense of moving the older weaponry then away from what could possibly be the front lines where it may not be needed?
I see. No, I think in my perception, you have a lot of inventories of those armories, and these inventories have sometimes some 200 or 300 pages. And I think they kept a kind of selection of the old weapons, and they turned the old weapons into new one. You have a lot of refracturing old weapons into new one. And this makes those armories a kind of a metal depot. It means they tried to make use of the material and tried to bring it into a material cycle. And they kept some old famous cannons, for example, or some special weapons, breastplates and something like this. But it's very hard to see how they choose. How did they make the choice what to keep and what to recycle?
Thank you so much.
What I see, yes.
Isidore?
Yes, hello. I apologize for not having my camera on, but it's something's broken. I don't know what it is. I want to thank you, Professor Martin, for this wonderful lecture, wonderful presentation. My question is basically a comment. So you were discussing now these civic militias, citizens, armed citizens, and you rightfully mentioned that on the one hand we have these state militaries starting to build up and basically like starting to exclude them. But I was wondering about the other side, the mercenaries, and how they affected the civic militias. Because we know from Machiavelli has this famous chapter in his Il Principe, where he talks about like about the mercenaries, about the condottieri, and about the civic militias, and how civic militias are actually better because they're more reliable and etc. But in actuality, yes. So he formed a civic militia in Florence, and he won one battle in Pisa, but then he won the next. He lost the next battle. So we already see here how complicated these things are. So I just want to ask you this relationship between the mercenaries or contractors and civic militias in the early modern era. And thank you.
Yeah, difficult question, I think. On the one hand, we might talk about the value of those burghers who were armed. Were they as good as to compete with trained soldiers or not? And it seems to be the longer the early modern goes, they were not competitive anymore, because in 16th century, first siege of Vienna, we have a lot of trained soldiers coming in to defend the city, and the same story at the second siege of Vienna. But I think in the wake of the formation of the early modern state, and as a result, I think very much of the 30-year war, this means as a soldier, you have to be very, very trained. You see some handbooks of soldiers that list 136 different ways of handling the weapon in order to make one shot. This means you have to be very trained, and you have to be trained under fire, which means a lot of stress. And this I think they tried to compete, but they were in the long run not good enough in order to function as a regular military. And this means they were more and more pulled down to a kind of decorative army, which is used during the Corpus Christ procession, and to be a kind of staffage for the emperor coming in the city and saying hello, to put it very easy. I don't know if this meets your question correctly.
Oh, definitely. No, I just wanted to point out, because we usually have this stereotype still in hand that like the early modern state basically erodes the mercenaries from the early modern like warfare. But we know now from the works by David Parrott from Oxford. He wrote a book, The Business of Arms, I think in 2012, where he talks about this military enterprise. And it's not just about like warfare per se. It's also like provisions, it's victualling, like building of states. And states usually relied on those like subcontractors to provide like victuals and so on. So this is an important aspect. And just before I finish, I also want to remind you of the famous Rembrandt painting, The Night Watch.
Yes, right.
Yeah, just as a detail, but yeah, thank you again.
In Amsterdam, yes, The Night Watch, very famous, yes, thank you.
Thank you both. And Anna, please.
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. My question is about a thing you've mentioned in passing. I'm sorry if I've missed the answer already, but so it's about cases when women as widows became kind of heads of households and citizens in a way. Were there any provisions that they were supposed to somehow compensate financially or find men in their stead for these civic guard duties and so on, as they were unable to perform them themselves?
Okay, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but your question was concerning the widows, right?
Yeah, about when women were heads of households, like widows, and they couldn't perform civic guard duties themselves. What were they supposed to do?
Yes, at least in my perception, widows had very often they were given some weapons by their late husbands, and those weapons were very often part or became part of a second-hand market for weapons, which must have been excessive. This means it must have been very easy to buy weapons and in order for new male citizens who come in the city, you had to present those weapons in front of the town council. Your question is, how did those widows manage with the night guard, for example? And normally, at least in my perception, they pay money for other people to do this duty. On the other hand, you have a lot of widows who run handcraft companies, for example, doing some blacksmith work and something like this. This is quite often seen. Does this answer your question or not at all?
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm not sure whether I got it right. Thank you.
Okay, then there was a question by Karen Culver, which is in the chat, and I will read it. Thank you for your really interesting paper. You say the collections kept in armories was of high value. Please, do you have any information on the management of the arms? In terms of keeping track in the weapons, who had taken them, where they were and when? And is there any information on how explosives were stored in order to keep them safe?
Yeah, very interesting question you have. Thank you. Well, this story of armories is a story of explosions, a lot of explosions, and therefore they tried to have a special powder storage houses which had an extremely easy upgoing roof. In order, this means if the powder explodes, the roof takes off and all the effect of those explosions will go in the air. We have a lot of inventories. We know normally, at least from the Viennese armory, we have, I think, seven inventories where all the weapons are described. And especially the cannons, for example, have names, very often names of women. Mm-hmm. In the 16th century, we have names for cannons such as Catherine or something like this. There is also kind of landing of weapons among the different armories, especially, for example, during the Peasants' Wars. We have some records where they say, yes, we need weapons in order to beat the peasants, and they are landed and they are not given back. And therefore, we have some another additional writings where they claim for giving back the weapons. There must have been a kind of landing system of weapons, especially in times of crisis. This is for sure more or less a story of the emperor and his defense system. But I think there could be also kind of landing of armories in times of crisis during different cities, but I have no evidence for this.
Yeah.
But to keep, maybe just to add, to keep weapons fit for use means a lot of work. You have to oil them, you have to look whether the gunpowder is still working or not, and so on and so on. This means the armorer has a lot of servants who looked steadily and constantly for those weapons in order to keep them in use.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, very interesting things. At the moment, there are no more questions, so I ask people to to invent new ones. In the meantime, I have one, but rather out of curiosity, but because I have no idea of the history of weapons. Um, Once you use the term of a culture of weapons or something which nowadays we would think of the United States of America. But related to this, in early modern towns, was there in every town a shop where you could buy weapons, where you just could go there, or did you go to the blacksmith or to a special weapons manufacturer? Because you said also, if I correctly remember, that in Innsbruck, in this Book of Citizens, 3/5 of the citizens who enrolled, they already had weapons. So this is just a simple question. Where could you buy weapons in an early modern town?
Simple questions are always very, very difficult to answer. I resist. No, no idea. Regula Schmidt, where a Swiss colleague, had some traces which we don't have, at least to my knowledge, not in Austrian cities. They have a kind of Harnisch register. This means they have a kind of register, which burger has which type of armory. And I don't know how they did get it. It must be, on the one hand, a kind of second hand market. But what does this mean? If you have a kind of a siege and you turn on with a breastplate which is some 100 years old, you will have maybe some problems with it. I think the blacksmiths must have had a specific role, and Ferdinand Oppel is maybe also among us. You would maybe see the Schwertfeger, for example. You have some weapon production normally within greater cities, and you have a kind of specializations for weapons. Suler muskets, for example. Thüringen, you know.
Yeah, it's in the south of our country, yes.
Yes, a lot of weapon production in Thüringen. And this must be, and also in Styria, for example. Styria is a kind of a pre-modern, pre-industrialized region. Turtle, for example, you can have a lot of weapon production, and especially in 30 years war, we know some regions became weapon production centers. The Netherlands, for example, and this must be the origin maybe of the more specific weapon systems you have in the Willock guns and something like this. It must have become more and more difficult to produce difficult weapons, at least in my perception.
Yeah, Ferdinand Oppel, would you like to enter here?
Thank you very much for this wonderful paper, Martin. In fact, I would like to add there is another factor, because where do you find metal? In northern Hungary, you find it in Styria, and so it's clear that the transport was very difficult, but these are the regions where weapons were also produced. And this is a factor that has not been discussed very widely, but I think you have to combine the production sites with the sites where the metal was to be found.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's logic. So there is a question by Alexandra K., please.
Hello. I do think that Professor Stärken was before me. I don't know if you want to be first or if I just go ahead.
Go ahead. It's
okay.
I think it's not very important.
So then, hello, Martin.
Hello.
As you know, I am more specialized in the late medieval period. I've worked on the period of the Hussite Wars, which is in the first half of the 15th century. And I've worked with sources from imperial cities mostly. And recently I've worked with account books from the city of Regensburg, which you had on one of your slides. I was very happy to see the big storage building there. And before I have worked on account books from Görlitz, which is in modern day Saxony, which is close to today's Czech Republic. And in both instances, I remember reading there about stables, horse keeping, that not only the burghers were supposed to keep horses that were then used whenever there was a crisis, there was the call to the people that had horses to provide the horses during the military crisis. And I know, for instance, from Regensburg, there was in the first town war, which is at the end of the 14th century, they, for instance, was a decision that nobody was allowed to buy oat except people that were keeping horses. So there was a planned rationalizing of victuals that were important for the horse keeping. And I also remember having seen traces of something like a Marstall, some civic stable, probably not only for the purposes of war, but also for the messengers to keep the communication going. And I have no idea about how the situation is in Austria and in the early modern period. Do you know anything about these Marställe? Is there anything similar in the sources that you know about? Or does this really get out of this, into disuse once infantry becomes so much more important in the field?
I don't know, have any experience on this. The horses must have an essential function for the armories too, because if you move cannons to the ramparts, you have to have horses, and strong horses. This means you have to feed them properly in order they can pull what they should pull. No idea. I know from the horse keeping only from the Hofquartierbücher in Vienna, where the Viennese court has a lot of horses, and some of the horses have to be kept in citizens' houses because there was not, the stables weren't big enough in Vienna to keep all the horses. The Viennese court, this is a group of 2,000 people, couldn't keep all of them in the stables, in the Hofmarstall, as you told it, which was outside from the fortress in Vienna. Now I just can, Ferdinand?
Yes, so if I may add directly to that point, in Vienna, the normal burger house was equipped with a stable. And the burghers who were able to provide horses for military purposes, they were the rich persons, because there are sources that are speaking about Burger die Rossvermögen, burghers who are able to provide horses for normally military purposes or transport purposes. As Alexandra has said, also the messages between towns, it was necessary to have the transport means. It's an interesting part that should not be left out of the discussion about arms in cities. Horses were very important for the possibility to act on a battlefield in these times. It's clear that in the early modern period, the infantry became much more important. But in the late medieval and early modern period, I think the role of horses should be taken into account.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
Very interesting point. I think Reinhard Koselleck, you know Reinhard Koselleck as a great historian of time movement. But he was in Second World War, he was responsible for horses. He was in a horse company, and therefore he divided the period of the horses with the post-equestrian period. Pferdezeitalter und Post-Pferdezeitalter. And it's the same story with Ulrich Raulf, the last century of the horses, where he describes the immense importance of those horses they had, especially in terms of the noblemen. Horses were extremely expensive if they had different colors, for example. The Italians in 16th century Mantua were famous for their stable management. And this is also a story of storage of horses, but it's also a story of weapons. You're right, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to talking about it, hopefully one time more.
Yes, that's what we do.
Okay, now Martina Stärken from Zurich, please.
Hello, thank you very much, Martin, for your stimulating paper. I've got two little points to make or to ask. One is about the Corpus Christi procession. And I was really intrigued by the fact that the citizens go armed and take part armed in the Corpus Christi procession. So my question is it just a normal thing, or was it a fact in times of war or of crisis of any kind? So this is the one question, and the other one refers to the weapon production we were discussing before. And you see in the civic registers of Swiss towns, you see that the towns and cities try to attract specialized weapon makers in some periods of time. So this question of weapon makers in town would be quite an interesting question too, and the fact that the city thought in special moments that a specialized weapon maker would be needed, and they tried to somehow attract them also with privileges. So this is a thing I would like to know a bit more about. Yes, well, these 2 points. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know, in my perception, because I have a view of a Central European urban historian, all the Corpus Christi processions are accompanied by citizens in arms. This has maybe its origin in the 16th century, when we have a lot of quarrels about Corpus Christi processions, because the Habsburg tried to keep on those processions, and the Protestant burghers stopped those processions. And in the 1570s, you have a kind of a rather famous thing, which was called the Viennese Milchkrieg, the war of milk, when the Corpus Christi procession was disturbed by Protestant burghers. They stopped it, and we find some traces in the Wikiana of this Milchkrieg, famous picture you always see normally. And the Habsburgs accompanied those processions, and they were disturbed by Protestant burghers. This is maybe the origin why normally during Corpus Christi processions you have the civic course of the armed burghers and citizens accompanied to these processions. This is quite normal. This is so normal. I didn't really knew or noticed it. It is unusual or uncommon. I don't know how it is in Zurich.
Yeah, I think you were just mentioning the reason for that, because it's a 16th century thing probably, and it's about the Protestant some difficulties between Protestants and Catholics in some towns. But in Zurich, for instance, the town is totally reformed, yeah, sure. So you haven't got any problems of that kind anymore.
But you would have a lot of quarrels in Reformation times on these processions, haven't you?
Yes, of course. The processions are on stake, and they are abolished.
Yeah,
you don't have them anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. And the second question was the attraction of specialists to the cities. This must be, of course, be of interest, have been of interest for the cities. I just mentioned the one example I have in the citizen registers of Vienna. After 1683, a lot of blacksmiths must have been dead, maybe due the result of some diseases as a result of the siege, I don't know. And in the wake of this second siege of Vienna, you have a lot of accepted blacksmiths. This means metal specialists which were attracted. The Bürgerrecht was at that moment very easy to get. And this means this must have opened chances for specialists to come in the city. That's what I see in the sources I have.
Thank you. Then there is a question by Edleva, but we have also a comment from Carlo in the chat who says powerhouses have always wooden floors to keep them dry.
Yeah.
This is then also the reason why they easily got fire and could explode.
Thank you.
Hello from me. Thank you for the paper. It was really very interesting. And I have a question with regard to the networks, actually. It's about Helmut and the sword of Skanderbeg, who initially was in the arsenal of Venice, brought there from his widow. And then it was taken by Wolfgang of Stubenberg and brought to the Museum of Arms, Zeughaus of Charles II, and then Archduke of Austria. Yeah. And then they were brought together by the son of, by Archduke Ferdinand II. And he kept them in the Museum of Ambras Castle. In 1806, then they were brought to Kunsthistorisches Museum. So you raised my curiosity by the this praxis of destroying some weapons. On the other hand, here we see an example of preserving weapons of Skanderbeg. Now, I don't know whether they connected it with the name and that's why they preserved it, or because the quality of these is not good. It's at least of the spade. Probably that's also the reason. But this network, getting the weapons from Venice and from other places, it's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. I can really add anything, but I think it's quite normal that they kept some special examples. This means weapons which were extremely expensive or which had a different story, and those weapons were kept. Although they came out of fashion, and that's maybe a kind of the starting point of a kind of musealization of these armories. That's quite obvious. But I have now, maybe one could find some traces of these exceptional weapons in travel accounts. Because in travel accounts, armories are a kind of some of the musts you have to see of a city if the travelers are of a certain nobility, for example. That's all I can add. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. Thank you, Edleva.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last chance for a last question. What I found interesting is that you, Martin, told us another story of the invention of the museum. Right, because you could perhaps have an exchange with Krzysztof Pomian, who wrote this heavy volume of the history of the museum. And he probably had not an eye on the weapons so much as you showed us for the European cities.
Yeah, that's an idea. Thank you.
Okay, then everything is clear, I think. Martin, I know that you have another event this evening, so it's perhaps also good for you. And as I already announced in the beginning, I have, besides the announcement of next week's lecture, which will be given by Miri Rubin, on the topic how strange were strangers of medieval cities. We have also a common announcement, and I give the microphone now to Kati.
Thank you very much, Susanne, and of course, thank you, Martin, for your wonderful presentation. Now, this announcement sounds more mysterious than it really is, but it's still very good news, namely that this lecture series, as we have also mentioned at the very beginning of the series, but not all of you were here, there is always a little bit of a change of the audience. So this is connected to a planned summer university course on the same topic, but more of a Central European focus. So the official title is Urban Governance and Civic Participation in Words and Stone, Urbanism in Central Europe, 1200 to 1600. And now the good news is that it has been approved. So we will get money to organize it, and it will also be possible for you to apply to join, especially, of course, graduate students and young academics. And the main attraction probably of this summer university course will be that it will bridge 3 cities. It will start in Budapest. We will be here for about a week, then move to Prague via Brno. So we will spend daytime in Brno and then 3 more days in Prague. And this will combine, hopefully, in-person site visits to monuments and also lectures connected to them and connected to some of the issues about which now you hear in the lecture series in a broader European and even worldwide perspective. So this is an invitation. The website of the course is currently being developed. So I hope that before the end of this series, we can also post in the chat the website. And those of you who are already senior scholars, you can encourage your students or younger colleagues to look at the possibility, and you're all welcome to join. We just have to make sure that it happens in person, which is, of course, not only in our capacity to decide. So thank you very much again. And thank you, Susanne and Martin, for making this evening so rewarding.